Chapter on fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. So we'll start the slideshow. So some of the learning outcomes that we will have for this chapter. So we need to understand the terms about what the terms fluid balance, electrolyte balance, and acid-base balance mean, and discuss their importance in homeostasis, because we know that this balance is really important in homeostasis. So we're going to look at the composition of intracellular and extracellular fluids. So we're going to look at how we regulate fluids in these systems, fluids, electrolytes, and we're going to look at some of the hormones that will play a role in balancing the fluids and electrolytes in our body. We'll look at the movement of fluid within the extracellular fluid, and then between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, and then between the extracellular fluid and the environment. And some of these we will not look into in great detail. So we'll also look at the mechanisms by which sodium, potassium, calcium, and chloride ion concentrations are regulated. We'll definitely look at sodium and potassium and calcium, not so much the chloride ions. And then we'll look at the buffering systems, and that will be the last thing that we'll look at, is the buffering systems and how it also helps to maintain homeostasis. Some of the most frequent disturbances of these acid-base balances, and then how our body would respond to these disturbances. And we'll look a teeny bit at the effects of aging. So if we start looking at the fluid within our body, so it's about 50 to 60% of our total body water composition is fluid. We also do have minerals in our fluid, and this is they are dissolved within the fluid within our body, and it forms our electrolytes. So if we look at the different compartments that we have in place, we have intracellular fluid, which obviously, as it sounds, inside of the cell. The water content of these is really going to vary from cell to cell, depending on, say, if it's like a muscle cell, which is going to have a higher water content, or a fat cell, which is going to be hydrophobic and have a lower water content. This intracellular fluid is separated from the extracellular fluid by that plasma membrane. And so we're going to have transport of the fluid back and forth across that plasma membrane. Then if we look at extracellular fluid, it is going to be interstitial, so all the fluid outside of a cell. So the interstitial fluid, we're going to have plasma and other body fluids that are going to be involved in this. And 99% of this fluid is going to be water. And we'll talk about how women have a smaller volume of blood than men, so obviously they have a little less extracellular fluid than men. Actually, if we look at this chart here, we can see this is men at the top and women at the bottom. So for men, they're about 40% solids. They're 33% intracellular fluid, 21.5% extracellular fluid, and plasma about 4.5%. Whereas women, solids are about 50%, intracellular fluid 27%, interstitial 18%, and plasma again at 4.5%. So we do have variations between the genders when it comes to volume. If we look at a 155-pound or 154-pound individual who has a minimum of body fat, this is what their solid components are going to look like. So the large majority is going to be the proteins, with lipids, minerals, carbohydrate, and miscellaneous filling it in. So about 69 pounds of that 154 pounds is going to be the solid components of their body. So if we look at fluid balance, we do know that there's a daily balance that takes place between the amount of water that we take in, or the amount of water gained, and the amount of water that we lose to the environment. So this is going to involve us regulating the content and how much water we take in and how much water we actually get rid of. So the primary system that does this is the digestive system. It is the primary source of our water gains. Obviously, we drink a lot of water in, and we also get a little bit from metabolic activity. As you know, the production of ATP, you end up with carbon dioxide and water and ATP. And then the urinary system is our primary route of water loss, but we can also lose it through insensible perspiration, and then flat out sweating. We can lose a lot of it through that route. We do know that if someone has diarrhea or vomiting, excessive amounts of vomiting, that we can really lose large amounts of water, and we may have a loss of that fluid balance. So fluid balance actually is the amount gained compared to the amount lost, and they should equal each other throughout the day in order to maintain health. So if we look for water in our bodies, so 60% of the male body is water, and 50% in the female body. Females tend to have a little more of body fat, and so that's why it's 60%. We should have more, but we're smaller, and so that's why we have 50% and 60% for males. And most of it's in the intracellular fluid. And then water exchange, so we're going to have water exchange take place between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid, and this occurs across that plasma membrane. So we're looking at osmosis, diffusion, and there is a carrier-mediated transport that can also have exchange take place between those two compartments. So if we have intracellular and extracellular compartments balance, so we know that intracellular fluid is about 2/3 of total body water, extracellular fluid is about 1/3 of our total body water, and as we talked about, they have a very different composition. So extracellular fluid, we know that there's going to be sodium chloride and bicarbonate are going to be the principal ions in the extracellular fluid. Intercellular fluid, we're looking at potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and some protein ions that are going to be present in the intracellular fluid. But they are at an osmotic equilibrium when it comes to the amount of ions that are present or solute. So the loss of water from the extracellular fluid, if you have a loss of water from your extracellular fluid, so say you're dehydrated, that water is initially going to be replaced by the water in the intracellular fluid. So you'll have a fluid shift. So this can happen very, very quickly, minutes to hours, and it's going to try to restore that osmotic equilibrium that takes place. So it's going to basically monitor the water in your extracellular fluid, not in your intracellular fluid, and we'll see here in a second what it's monitoring. So if we have dehydration, so this is a long-term transfer, but it still cannot replace the extracellular water loss that's taken place. It's going to take the water out of the intracellular fluid and try to put it into the extracellular fluid to increase the volume of your blood, but it's not going to be able to do that because there's not enough present. So then we're going to be starting to look at some homeostatic mechanisms to increase that extracellular fluid, and we've talked about these in the past. So we're looking at aldosterone, we're looking at ADH that will actually try to increase that fluid volume, extracellular fluid volume. So these are the factors that affect extracellular fluid volume. So we have some metabolic water that is produced by the cells that goes into the extracellular fluid. So this intracellular fluid goes into the extracellular fluid. We have water absorbed across the digestive epithelium. We lose water in respiration and evaporation from surfaces of the body. We lose some water in the feces, and we saw last chapter, or the digestive chapter, we try to hold on as much as possible. And then we lose water by sweat glands, and then we lose water by urination. So this really needs to equal out over the day, the amount that we lose and the amount that we bring in or produce. We would like them to be in balance. So if we look at the changes in the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid when you have water losses that outpace water gains, so this is your intracellular fluid, this is your extracellular fluid, and so these two are in balance. So the two solutions are isotonic, so they have the same tonicity. So then if we have extracellular water loss, so it's going to kind of reduce the volume of that extracellular fluid. So it's going to make this fluid hypertonic. So you can see the little dots are really crowded together. Those solutes are very packed in there. So then you're going to have the intracellular fluid is going to transfer fluid over to the extracellular fluid, and again returning that osmotic equilibrium back to the fluid. And this is what our body tries to do, is to return that osmotic equilibrium back. Can you guys hear my dogs downstairs barking? naughty puppies. So if we look at fluid compartments, so some of the basic concepts in regulation of fluids and electrolytes in our body. So if we look at homeostatic mechanisms, they're going to actually be monitoring our extracellular fluid, not our intracellular fluid. So we're looking at our plasma, we're looking at changes in our cerebrospinal fluid, and that's where changes will be made if these fluids composition has been altered. So we know that there's no receptors that directly monitor fluid or electrolyte balance, but it will monitor plasma volume, and it will monitor osmotic concentration. So these things are closely monitored. And we know cells cannot move water molecules by active transport. So it's usually osmosis. We saw diffusion, facilitated transport. So we know, if you remember, water follows salt, or salt sucks water, you know that it's a passive process that takes place. And then if we look at the body's water or electrolyte content will rise if dietary gains exceed environmental losses, and will fall if losses exceed gains. So that makes sense that you would be having changes that take place. So if we look at electrolyte balances, so we know electrolytes are ions that are released through dissociation in organic compounds, and we know that these electrolytes can conduct electrical current in solution. So we know electrolytes are very, very important, and when you have a loss of electrolytes, you can tend to have some severe problems take place. So if you have an electrolyte balance, you have to have the rates of gain and loss of each of these electrolytes be equal in the body. So we know that electrolyte concentration directly affects water balance. And as I talked about, the concentration of individual electrolytes, so like calcium, the concentration of that can affect a cell. Potassium, sodium, all can affect the function of the cell. So electrolyte balance primarily involves balancing rates of absorption across the digestive tract and rates of loss at the kidneys and sweat glands. So we know that when you have too much calcium in your body, that you will actually have an increased loss of calcium in the urine. If you don't have enough calcium within your system, you'll have increased absorption of calcium across the digestive tract. So those are the kinds of regulations that we're talking about. So sodium balance. So when sodium gains equal sodium losses. So small changes in sodium are accommodated by changes in the extracellular fluid. So if you have a huge loss of salt, you will aldosterone will hold on to the sodium, which will then suck the water back in it. Homeostatic responses involve two parts. So we know that ADH will control the water loss or retention by the kidneys, and it'll cause you to have increased thirst. So when you have too much water, you may be hyponatremic, and so aldosterone will be secreted, and so then you can hold on to that sodium. You will have some fluid exchange take place between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, trying to get that isotonic balance back in place. We do know that sodium is the dominant cation of extracellular fluid. It's about 90% of the extracellular fluid osmotic concentration, and we're looking at sodium chloride and sodium bicarbonate that are making up that extracellular fluid osmotic concentration. So sodium is very important within our system to maintain homeostasis. I would say in this country we don't have a problem having enough sodium within our system. So these are the mechanisms that regulate sodium balance when sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid changes. So normal sodium concentration. So you eat a bag of potato chips and you drink nothing, or you eat those potato chips without taking a drink. The plasma concentrations are going to rise temporarily. So your homeostasis has been disturbed. So the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are stimulated. So you're going to have ADH that's going to be secreted. You're going to stop losing water. You're going to hold on to the water that you have within your system. It's going to stimulate your thirst, and hoping that you're going to drink more water, not beer. And then because the ECF osmolarity increases, water is going to shift out of the intracellular fluid, increasing that intracellular fluid volume and lowering your extracellular fluid sodium concentrations. So then you have homeostasis return, decreased sodium levels in your extracellular fluid, and you'll go back to homeostasis. And hopefully you keep drinking water to replace that intracellular fluid that you lost. And then this is, again, normal sodium concentration. So you have decreased levels of sodium in your extracellular fluid. So you're going to have osmoreceptors, again, your hypothalamus are going to be inhibited. So ADH is going to be shut off. So as soon as the osmotic concentration of the extracellular fluid drops by 2% or more, ADH secretions decreases. It's going to suppress your thirst, and you're going to start releasing more water from your kidneys. Water loss reduces your extracellular volume. It's going to concentrate your ions in your solution or in your body water, and you're going to have increased sodium levels in your extracellular fluid, returning you back to homeostasis. So if we look at sodium balance a little bit more here, so this is the big problem in the United States, is that changes in sodium are accommodated by changes in your blood pressure and your volume. So hyponatremia is low extracellular fluid sodium concentrations. So overhydration or inadequate salt intake. And so obviously this inadequate salt intake is not a huge problem in the United States. And most of the time when we see overhydration, it's someone with a psychological condition or someone who is being forced to drink large amounts of water. And so you don't see hyponatremia very often. We do see lots and lots of hypernatremia, so high extracellular fluid sodium concentrations, and commonly from dehydration. But so if people are dehydrated and they're taking in a lot of salt, they'll end up with a hypernatremia. You can actually end up with hypernatremia and have good water volume, but you want to make sure that if then you would definitely have high blood pressure if you have normal fluid and increased amounts of salt, because then you're going to have more water sucked into your circulation. And then again, if we look at sodium balance in the exchange, are accommodated by the blood pressure changes, so increased blood pressure and volume, so that natriuretic peptide will be released. Increased sodium and water losses are going to take place in the urine. So they basically go against ADH and aldosterone, and they go against them. And epinephrine and norepinephrine also are going to be inhibited, trying to decrease the amount of blood volume that you have. And then decreased blood volume and blood pressure, you're definitely going to have an endocrine response, and this is where your good old ADH comes in, your antidiuretic hormone, your aldosterone, and the RAS mechanism, which is the renin, angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, an S system, RAS mechanism kicks in, and this is going to be an opposite bodily response to the ones above. So it's going to try to increase your blood volume. All right, we're going to stop there, and we'll continue in a minute.